Welcome back and to the series on mapping the shadow. So in today's episode, we're going to be continuing on the theme of freedom in the material world. So talking about work and contribution and the workings of finance and livelihood and so on. In truth, of course, this entire series has been about freedom, but freedom is a concept that pervades everything. It's not just what you might ordinarily think of as freedom, like freedom to do what you want in the world, or freedom to go where you want, or do the kind of work you want to do. That is certainly part of freedom, but freedom is all encompassing. It's about your mind, ultimately. That all said, I think the material aspect of freedom is not only key, but also one that's quite a sexy sell to many people, right? Because it embodies the image of freedom perhaps more than any other. We can fall in love with certain images of all kinds, like whether it's a religious symbol, whether it's another person, whether it's some kind of physical prowess or strength, like a hero figure. These are all essentially and effectively providing imagery for the self, ways of connecting to the undivided self. They provide ways of relating to it and learning about it. But in just the same way, all forms of appearances in this world can be both vehicles and traps. And it's really important to notice the difference there and not allow yourself to become trapped. Or at least when you inevitably do, that you make good of it and you learn from it. So today we're going to be talking more about work and contribution, like I said. And this is a very key part of this whole pursuit of self-knowledge. Because, well, we've all got to work, right? It's absolutely fundamental. To not work, or actually I prefer the word contribution, because that's in essence what work is about. To not contribute would to contradict yourself, because we all need to take something from this world. We all need to eat, we all need shelter, we all need these basic things. And we actually all need a lot more than that as well, just to provide the support for our own process, our own journey, the material basis for our own self-realization. It's really important. And so if that's what you aspire to, then when you do manage to generate wealth, you'll find that it actually supports that process in a really powerful way. If that's not what you aspire to, and you're actually more interested in power and dragging other people into various forms of master-slave dynamic, then attaining more resources somehow, I wonder how you figure that out, is just going to exacerbate that entire intention. It's just going to make you more of a tyrant and lead to a greater fall in the end as well. So this all comes under what I call habit 4. And this is part of my 7 habits of individuation model, which I talk about at length in the course called The Way of Individuation, which is available on knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. So feel free to check that out if you want more info. You can also download a free 45-page PDF, just an introductory guide there at makeitconscious.com. So habit 4 is what I've termed contribute your unique and specific value. So this is a key part of any individuation journey, because for the reasons I've said, contribution is not only helpful, but necessary. Not only necessary, but extremely gratifying. And so if you feel like you're merely just going to work and dragging yourself to the train and taking the metro into town and just doing this grinding task that you just cannot bear, then it would be a tall order to call that contribution, right? There's maybe some contribution involved in that, but if you're just dreading it, well, that's because you're not realizing your full potential through it on one hand, but also because you don't necessarily endorse or see the value in what it's creating. Maybe you thought you saw value at one point, and then you actually started to see through it. You actually saw through the power position. You let go of the conscious thesis, or what happened was you developed a more mature and integrated thesis by integrating what you'd left out. So if you were selling a certain product and you saw that there was some value in that, but you also started to realize actually it fell short in certain ways, or the way you were selling it or the company you're working for was harming people in certain ways, and they didn't follow through on their promises and so on. It's not about necessarily completely abandoning the whole idea, but what it's about is coming to terms with what's been left out, and then coming to a higher order understanding of what it was you were trying to achieve in the first place. So it's not abandoning the thesis, it's actually developing a more nuanced form of it. So that might involve letting go of certain pursuits or even certain products. Or it might not. It might involve doubling down on those same products, but in a new and more sophisticated way that considers both sides. So that's why contribution is absolutely essential. It's essential for health. It's essential for mental health. Like I said, if you're not doing it, you're selling yourself short as well as everyone else. And so to actually deliver on this then, well, there's two extremes that many of us might naturally fall on one side of. So the first side in which you might fall down on here might be to show up in a way that's very, very idiosyncratic and creative and self-expressive. There's nothing wrong with that. This is like just doing what you want at any cost. So it's not the authenticity that's the problem, quite the opposite. It's actually the denial of the wider reality that's the problem. This is often the way with the shadow map. It's like, it's not always the conscious thesis that's the problem. It's often the denial of the opposite that's the problem. It's like in the case of efficiency, maybe this is how we show up at work. Maybe we want to be very efficient. It's not that efficiency is the problem. It's actually that it lacks consideration unless it incorporates the other side. Likewise with discipline, it's not that structure and discipline in themselves are problems, except for that you take them to such an extreme that it brings to light what's been left out. It shows you implicitly what's been left out in that thesis. So in kind of the same way, doubling down on just what you want to do through your sheer self-willed determination is great and wonderful, and that's necessary. It's a good thing, except for the fact that it, and insofar as it denies not just the needs of others, not just the needs of the world and the structure of the world, but the very lessons you need in order to embody that authenticity fully. That's the key. And so the first facet of habit 4, I've called know your unique set of facts. So this sort of somewhat aligns to that first half of the dialectic here, in that someone who knows their unique set of facts is just doubling down on those ad infinitum, like paying no attention to what's actually needed in the world. So of course, the other side of the dialectic then is something like just meeting specification no matter what, just aiming to do entirely what's expected of you. There's many people and families like this. Many families drum this into their kids. It's pretty common, right? Amongst my generation, this is often how things were done. It's like, you just must do this. You must please your teachers. You must follow this route. You must get to work for a good company. Because that's what a lot of the boomer generation were able to achieve. And for a lot of them, that actually did facilitate self-knowledge to quite some degree. And it gave them a base that they were able to then build on. As I said in the last episode, invest in cheap property, which just expanded in value like never before. And so it did work to an extent for the boomer generation. But for my generation, so the millennial generation, that same idea doesn't work to anything like the same degree. So whilst there's a need to understand the needs of others, if we take that as our guiding principle, we've just entered another master-slave dynamic here. So that's the other side of the dialectic. It is meeting specification. And so in terms of facets here, the second facet of habit 4, I've termed to meet the needs of the world. Now, there's value in that. It's a need to do that, because otherwise we're just going off heedlessly by ourselves, not really producing anything of any value to anyone. Now, it might just be like if you're a pedigree artist, maybe your value to the world is to just create and be as straight up and uncompromising in your creation as possible. There's many great artists like this. And yet, what makes them great artists, to a large degree, is that their work resonates with the time and place in which they are. And often not by pure coincidence either. They will always have some degree of sensitivity to that. They're not just some wild eccentric just doing whatever the heck they like and just throwing caution to the wind and screw everyone who doesn't like it. They might look like that on occasion, but actually there's a lot more depth to their art than maybe meets the eye, and a lot more sensitivity to the needs of the world around them in their art. So in a sense then, we're all artists when we go to work, whether you call yourself an artist or not, whether you're a consultant or a coach or creator or a writer or a musician or an accountant or a lawyer. If you're doing it right, you're an artist. If you're not an artist, you're not doing it right. You're not practicing habit 4, not fully. You're maybe trying to find the way forward. You're trying to complete that dialectic, but it's still one-sided and it's a work in progress. And so the third facet I just call generosity. Now, this is nothing cheesy. This is not like a lot of spiritual traditions talk about generosity in a way that's very self-aggrandizing, or this kind of like fake humility that you see a lot. No, it's not that. It's just recognizing the value of generosity. It's as simple as that. When you consider that pretty much everything good around us in the world came from generosity. It came from someone meeting these first two facets and channeling generosity into that. Just doing a good thing because it's a good thing, and that's enough because it's creative. So in this particular project, Make It Conscious, something that I noted quite early on is that when I was publishing active imagination videos, early on in that process, for every hour or so that I spent recording and editing and uploading, approximately 4 or 5 hours of watch time was delivered. So for every hour I spent, you guys spent about 4 or 5 hours listening and practicing. And now the multiple was not what was important there. What was important there was that was loosely speaking some kind of metric for whether what I was doing was essentially creative or not worth my time. Because if I was spending 10 hours to make exercises and there was only 2 or 3 hours of watch time, then in some kind of way I've sort of like destroyed 7 hours of time. Not literally, but it's a metric for whether what I was doing was actually creative in some sense. It was bringing more into the world than it was taking. Not that it was taking anything from me, it's just that it was whether it's actually an inherently creative task. And so now that multiple has increased, which is great to see. But in the early days of that active imagination series, that actually gave me the feedback I needed to know that this was worth doing. This was something generous in that it was bringing something into the world that didn't exist before and creating something new that took less than it gave, that took less than it was producing. And so even though I didn't have as many views at that time, it gave me a little bit of encouragement to say, just carry on with this, just keep doing this and it will work out. Well, it was already going well, but it just said, if you keep going down this road, you're going to create something good of it. So yeah, that gave me the encouragement I needed. So then this third facet, generosity, is just a reminder of that. It's to say, when you show up at work, when you're blending these two facets together, just do what's right. Be creative, and not just at work, by the way. Actually, this is really key. Do this anywhere and any way. Yes, you channel it through work. That's what work is all about, in fact. Work is almost like the formal arrangement in which generosity is practiced. Let's call it that. Because if you're not creating something, then how can you justifiably take anything? So work is like the official way in which you channel generosity, but this is something you can do anywhere, anytime. Whether it's in the street, whether it's meeting your friends, meeting your family, whether it's the way you look after your family, you engage with your friends and family, even if it's just the way you speak to people. What you give doesn't necessarily have to consist of resources. It can consist of time and energy. And so if you bear in mind that little anecdote I just gave, look for ways in which that might show up in the world around you as well. And just know that even though work might be the formal way in which you channel generosity, because it's not the only way, there is also a way in which it circulates back to you. And that's not the reason you do it, of course. You don't give money to people in the street because you want something back, but you do it because you understand the virtues of it and the generosity, and actually you giving someone $1, it might mean nothing to you, but it might mean a lot to them. Now, I'm not advocating just for blind, emotionally led generosity here either, by the way. Definitely not. You still have to practice discernment. There's a lot of value in that too. And you still have to use your resources wisely. And in fact, as I mentioned in the previous episode, because freedom contains limitation, freedom is not actually entirely about just having boundless resources. If anything, it's about using the resources you have well. So again, take that into consideration. If it's something like what I was doing with the Active Imagination series, I don't have limitless time. Therefore, I needed to make a decision about whether what I was doing was a good use of time, or was it even a good enough use of time, or even the best use of time that I could have allocated. So you've got to take all this into account as well. And consider it holistically. If everyone went around just giving all their disposable income to charity, well, it doesn't take much imagination to understand how that would very quickly go off the rails, and has been going off the rails for years. So use your generosity with discernment and give it where it's due and where you feel that it's a good use of your time, energy, and resources. That's the point. So these two images here I'm now showing just simply illustrate the two sides of the dialectic that I just described. So for those who are listening on the podcast, basically what you've got here is on the left-hand side, what appears to be some kind of really messy artist studio with a guy standing there. The windows look really dirty and old, and the floor is just covered with bits of paper and art. There's just stuff everywhere, a few old canvases, an old chair. It looks kind of bleak, actually. But the point is that this guy is just heedlessly doing what he wants. He's so far down that extreme. He's maybe living the starving artist ideal, with emphasis on the starving word there, less so on the artist. So he's taken to such an extreme that it's no longer really the ideal that it purports to be. And so is he really that different from the opposite? So this other guy on the other extreme, you have a very stern looking guy in a grey suit with a grey tie, standing with his hands clasped, looking at the camera. Now this might have been many of you at some occasion. This was certainly me on occasion. I think I've probably dabbled in both of these at certain times in my life. But this guy standing against a grey background as well, like it couldn't be more bleak in his own way. And he's just standing there looking sad, but very well behaved. He's a very well behaved corporate employee. He's doing everything right. He's meeting every expectation. He's adhering to every specification. He's doing it all. And yet he's unhappy. What's that about? You told me this would be a good life. Where's my pension? Okay. So this is the other side of the dichotomy. This is the meeting the needs of the world dichotomy side of the dichotomy, but taken to such an extreme, meeting specification to the point where he actually hasn't met any specification whatsoever. He's met every so-called requirement apart from the one that matters, which is to develop himself and to realize himself. So there's truth and value to both sides of these. But the dialectic, as always, is a dynamic, unfolding process. And the truth, you might say, lies somewhere in the middle, but I think more accurately, the truth contains elements of both and emerges out as something that didn't exist before. So it's not about saying, okay, I do a little bit of the artist, a little bit of the corporate worker, and just find some arbitrary balance in the middle that I can more or less tolerate. No, because over time, you're not going to be able to tolerate it anymore. That's the point. There is no balance here. There's only sublation in the end. There's no compromise. There's no compromise in this. You take everything that's true and valuable from the artist and everything that's true and value from the worker, and you find and honor what is true to both and sublate those. That's what the shadow map is showing. That's how you find the self. That's how you find truth in the middle. But this is an ongoing task, and you might have to ebb and flow between both sides many, many times before you even realize that it's a dialectic that's going on. And even then, the dialectic continues. It's never ending. But there's a big difference between knowing there's a dialectic and not knowing, and trying to fall on one side, believing that you can make the world and yourself a certain way permanently, versus saying, okay, no, there's a journey here, and I understand it. I understand what the two extremes are, and I'm working towards a resolution. So let's move on from that. So I'm going to read you a blog post now from the famous Seth Godin, one of the greatest marketing thinkers in the world. Sometimes I wonder if maybe marketing wasn't even where he should have gone, because his writing is very powerful, very profound, and we need people like him in all walks of life, not least marketing. So he wrote this many years ago. And one of the things I love about Seth Godin is that he blogs every day without fail. He's, I think, done over 10,000 posts now. So however many years that is. And I remember one year, I had committed to writing a blog post every week. And so one Sunday morning, I took my laptop to a local cafe, opened it up. It's about 10 a.m. And as I'm sitting down to write, I get my daily email through from Seth Godin, complete, done, shipped, right into my inbox. Not only that, but bear in mind that Seth Godin lives on the east coast of the USA, so he was actually 5 hours behind me where I was at the time. So that left a mark on me. So this post is called Open or Closed. Culture moves in two ways, open and closed. If you're a teacher, in business, a politician, a parent, a leader, an oligarch, a media mogul, an oil baron, a salesperson, or a marketer, you need to make a choice that will alter how you work with others and the investments you make in our culture and your craft. Do you benefit from a population that's smarter, faster, and more connected than it used to be? Do you prefer transparency? Either you're riding the tide or pushing against it. Are you hoping that those you serve become more informed or less informed? Are you working to give people more autonomy or less? Do you want them to work to seek the truth or to be clouded in disbelief and confusion? Is it better if they're connected to one another or disconnected? More confidence or more fear? Outspoken in the face of injustice or silence? More independent or less? Difficult to control or easier? More science or more obedience? It's pretty clear that there are forces on both sides, individuals and organizations that are working for open, and those that seek to keep things closed instead. Take a side. So I hope that you take a side, and I hope that the side you take is open. And sad as I am to say, however, that I see a great deal of closed in our world today. I mean, this was written, I think, at least 10 years ago, if not more. I'll have to check. Amongst all the blog posts he's ever written, this one stands out as much as any other to me. It resonates greatly with what I'm talking about here, with the shadow map. Hopefully you can recognize that. Many aspects of it. The idea of people and organizations wanting to work for people's ignorance, that they're actually incentivized, or so they think, by people being less independent, more ignorant, less informed, more fearful, easier to control, more obedient. This is not contribution. This is not creating value. This is the master-slave dynamic. And so when you zoom out, you see that actually this is a better description of the fundamental story at play in our times and the forces at play in our world. It's not the economy. It's not the commercial world. These are but puzzle pieces in a wider unfolding of consciousness. And Seth Godin is actually very much alluding to that. What he's talking about, this idea of open versus closed, he's talking about, are you engaging in a dialectic with empathy towards greater realization? Or are you deliberately hijacking that process and distorting it and bending it into something else to serve your own weak and pitiful self-avoidance? That's the difference. That's what it comes down to. And you can make a business that serves open. They seem to be becoming fewer and further between. But I think that's as much, as I mentioned in the previous episode, a question of this waning cusp of activity in our world. There's more and more about the performance of value or the appearance of value in a particular kind of way. You see it a lot on social media, like the attempt to appear a certain way. It's always going to be like that. There's always going to be an element of that. But in many ways, in many facets of the world as it's configured today, that has reached a crescendo. And we're almost at that uncanny valley point where it's like, whoa, it looks so much like the thing that it's quite obviously not the thing anymore. So I don't see the prevalence of people and organizations working for closed as necessarily like the sign that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. I think it's part of a natural flux. And those arcs of that flux can be very, very long. They can last decades, maybe even centuries, maybe more, who knows. But overall, I tend to bend towards optimism. There's many reasons for that, which I won't delve into now in this particular episode, maybe another time. But there's many philosophical and spiritual reasons why I think there's reason to be optimistic. But optimism is also dangerous. So looking at the shadow map, the idea is not to comfort yourself with beliefs, because as soon as you believe anything, absolutely, it generates an opposite. So when I say I'm an optimist, this is not just some pragmatic belief. but that means nothing to you and ought to mean nothing to you unless you experience it in a similar kind of way. It doesn't negate the need to undergo the process of unfolding that I need to do, you need to do. It's something we've all got to do. So I'd encourage you to embrace yourself in your work and let the chips fall where they may. And that means working for open, in the words of Seth Godin. So I'm going to end now just by talking about the idea of influence, because when we talk about open and closed, I think one characteristic of the closed mindset and the closed approach to work is that it mistakes love for power, in the words of Michael Sarian. Like, it becomes obsessed with an idea of itself. And this shows up in many forms today in the pursuit of a following, the pursuit of certain metrics on social media, like the number of subscribers or followers. There's nothing wrong with having subscribers or followers. It's just that if that's what we isolate as a metric, if we think that that's the good thing, we just need to enhance that, and so therefore to create the appearance of selfhood, then we've missed the point. And I think this whole idea of influence, like wanting to have an influence on the world, I think it's largely fallacious. It is not to say that some people don't have more influence than others, but let's be clear here, because those who influence are themselves being influenced, and there's no one that's outside of that relationship. Like, those who are caught in a dissonance loop would like to have you believe otherwise. They might be, in fact will be, pretty much by definition, very, very inflated and believe that they're inherently special in some way. Of course, we're all special, but in a way that other people fundamentally don't share. And so this is just another form of the master-slave dynamic. But in that, there's a fallacy, because, well, where did you come from? Did you create yourself? Or were you born into this world? And if you're born into this world, are you not continually influenced as well by this world? So I illustrate this idea with a very simple and silly analogy again. Two images. On the left, you have a very sweet Southeast Asian lady, probably somewhere like Thailand or somewhere, selling durian by the side of the road. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried durian. It's a very interesting delicacy in many parts of Southeast Asia, and she looks very happy, and I don't blame her. Now, the guy on the right is a very stern-looking, slightly smug-looking guy in a suit, oldish kind of guy with a watch and a balding head, and he's sat in a very regal-looking red leather chair with his hands clasped. So this is supposed to be, in my mind, like someone very senior, working perhaps for a large organization, maybe a large global oil company or something, as an executive. So this is someone who appears to have a lot of power, a lot of so-called influence. Whereas the woman on the left, we might judge as having less influence. She just sells durian by the side of the road. How humble. She's not really involved in the overall global movement of resources that's going to affect billions of people, or the market price of oil. No, she's just selling durian, living a small life, ostensibly. But then what happens if this guy is traveling to Thailand for whatever reason? Maybe he's visiting some kind of oil well in Malaysia, and he walks down the street for a bit of downtime, and he comes across this sweet old lady selling durian. She lights him up. She gives him a smile. She shares some of her energy through generosity with this guy, and it lifts his spirit. She has an influence on him one way or another, and that may well then influence the decisions that he makes later that day, the way he conducts himself in the meeting, whatever it might be. So the point is that neither of these people are isolated. He is influencing a lot of other people, sure, but she is also influencing him. So even though he might on the surface have more direct influence over a greater number of people, that sort of negates when you realize actually she is also influencing him. And pick your scenario, it doesn't really matter. We're all influencing each other all the time. And so while there might be a lot of weight given to the idea that, well, he has more influence because he has more subordinates or whatever, and more wealth, I think the effect is not as great as many of us would assume. And this also reminds me of people throughout history, like who keep coming back to the idea of Hitler and Stalin. And undoubtedly, these are guys that did very, very evil things on a daily basis, as well as a sort of on a macro scale. And we look at them and think, well, they're the guys that did it. And we tend to gloss over the fact that, well, actually, also people put them there and didn't see what the problem was. So in a recent episode, I talked about the dangers of projection, but not just projecting your own apparent badness onto other people, but projecting your goodness onto people as well, and not seeing the reality and the moral transgressions that are occurring on a micro scale every moment of every day. So both of those are a problem and an obstacle to get over. So I just want to leave you with that. And the upshot of all this is that I think you can safely let go of the idea of influence or the need to have an influence. The best influence you can have is by embracing yourself fully and undergoing this dialectic. Let everything else just happen. And if you need to go out into the world to do that, you need to get a job, you need to start a business, you need to create content, you need to make what you want to make and say what you need to say, then do that. That's all part of this process. But do not necessarily feel or worry about not having enough influence, wanting to have influence. If you feel that way, that's how you feel. I'm not saying you shouldn't feel that way, but use this understanding as a way to help you work with that feeling through empathy. And also just understand that the desire for influence in itself runs the risk of inflation. There might be a degree to which a bit of influence is useful as a useful resource, sure. But when we bear in mind that you can influence someone who has more overt influence than anyone else, does that not mean that you also have influence? If you influence this all-round guy, then you're making quite an impact, right? So I'll leave that there. And with that, I shall thank you for your time and attention. Again, check out the Know Yourself program at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. That's my self-study program consisting of 5 courses and over 40 hours of content or something. So thanks again, and I shall see you in the next one.